Tonight we get a different perspective on UFOs, case studies from the Soviet Union. Our guest is Paul Stonehill, Mysterious Sky, Soviet UFO Phenomenon. Over the weekend, Art came back with his mind experiments. First time he's done that in many, many years to summon up UFOs. And actually, we're getting some reports that some are starting to pop up all over again. I don't know if it's coincidental. Of course, I don't believe in that. But we'll be back in a moment. Paul Stonehill, our guest, with some fascinating information about what's happening over Eastern Europe. That's next on Coast to Coast AM. Paul Stonehill was born in Kiev, came to the United States in 1972 in his youth. Paul helped smuggle people out from behind the Iron Curtain, aided dissidents, and smuggled banned literature into the USSR. Paul has worked as a journalist covering warfare as well as freelancing on stories about UFO and anomalous phenomena. In October of 93, Omni magazine featured a story about Paul's work and the research center that he had created back in 1991, the Russian Ufology Research Center. Since 1989, Paul has consulted for American television and motion picture production companies, and as well as corporate entities. His areas of expertise: Russian history, Soviet covert operations, corporate security issues, warfare in the former USSR, cross-cultural training, anomalous phenomena in Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and China. Very special guest tonight on Coast to Coast, Paul Stonehill. Hey, Paul, welcome back. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. God, the stories and the case studies we're going to talk about tonight are absolutely fantastic. I think some of these reports may be the best I've ever heard of.
Yes. You're getting reports from the largest country in the world, even today.
Paul, let's talk a little bit about your interest. Of course, you were born in Kiev. You came here in 72, and then you did some great things and some risky things trying to get people out of, the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain area. Why'd you do that?
Well, actually, I came here in 73, but I left in 72. But the point is that I believed in democracy for the country I was born in, and I always believed that there would be a much better future for the Soviet Union and the republics that comprised it under a democracy, not away from totalitarian system, away from suffocating regime, and in the end, I think I will prove to be right.
Does it seem that Putin is trying to bring Russia back into the form of government that the former Soviet Union once had?
I believe that Putin is trying to exert Russia as a separate and self-sustaining power. It's not an American type of democracy, and it's not something I really like. But it's what most of the Russian people like today, because although the country is poor, at the same time, he's giving them purpose and a position of being a world power.
How did you, Paul, get interested in investigating UFOs over Eastern Europe?
When I was a kid, I met somebody who was a Soviet pilot who back in 1930s had actually observed a UFO over the Soviet Arctic areas. And I was interested in the paranormal phenomena. Some information was, I was able to get from Soviet magazines, such as Technika Молодежи, which were publishing quite interesting and, I should say, progressive information about anomalous phenomena.
For the sake of brevity, even though we know the Soviet Union has been broken up into small countries now, including the large one, Russia, I'll just mention just the Soviets as we talk about these case studies here. In your opinion, the reports of these UFOs in the Soviet Union, in the oceans, witnessed by their cosmonauts, are they stronger cases than what we hear in other regions of this planet?
Yes, and we can go into some generalities. First of all, the cases have been observed by trained and experienced observers, such as naval officers or counterintelligence people. They were no-nonsense people. They had an aim in front of them. goal to study the such phenomena as unusual aerial formations or objects that pop out from the bottom of the ocean. How such objects affect their armed forces, and do they present any danger to the Soviet state? There was not even any doubt that UFOs exist or USOs, unidentified submersible objects. So all this was aside. There was there was no cynical discussion whether UFOs exist or not. Yes, they did. What danger do they present to the Soviet Union? Plus, the Soviet Union being a huge country, most of its areas are very hard to reach, presented in itself a gigantic panorama of UFO study. I will say UFO, but I also include USOs. And cases were fabulous. And the Soviet Union from Stalin on definitely wanted to know, what is it we are facing?
Tonight we're going to talk about some incredible cases, the Russian signs in the sky, the Tunguska situation that occurred in the early 1900s, submersibles, a situation, of course, in the Kola Peninsula, that sighting episode, Kaliningrad, also in Russia. We're going to talk about that as well. It seems to me, Paul, that the witnesses to Soviet sightings, the professionals, the pilots, seem to be a little more forthcoming than Americans of the same kind of credential.
Absolutely. And more than that, even though the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state, their scientists, some of their military high brass, let's say top generals, and astronomers wanted to study UFOs. There was even a movement back in 1967 to get so-called openness about UFOs, and the high point was when Soviet scientists and their military friends were able to actually present a program on Soviet television and appeal to the population, please help us understand this phenomenon. And it lasted for a short time, but it did. Nothing like that ever took place in the United States. I mean, this is fascinating with all the secrecy and cover-ups. You had more forthright information in the Soviet Union from interesting, and responsible people than you had in the United States.
Are you convinced, with all these sightings in the Soviet Union, that something very real is occurring here?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and it's more than just on the scale of our planet. Definitely in the near space. And what's more, I am convinced that there is an exchange of information between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the best example, I will never stop saying it, was the so-called Phobos space missions.
Let's talk about that before we get into some of these other cases, since you just brought it up. That was an episode where the Soviets sent a probe to Mars, right?
It was a joint Western Soviet mission to the planet Mars, but also to study its moonlet, Phobos and Deimos, especially Phobos. And the mission failed because one of the space probes disappeared on its way to the planet, and the other one, which is more important, was destroyed or kicked out from the area by something in 1989. It was spinned out from the orbit, and that something was a giant cylindrical object that the space probe was able to take a photograph of, and maybe some other objects, according to a Soviet scientist.
Apparently it was coming toward the satellite, toward the spaceship, and did take a picture or two, right?
It took a picture or two. Yes, absolutely. And again, the last picture that it took was of that gigantic object. But also, according to a Soviet scientist, and Philip and I have gone through Soviet media reports that we were able to get. Very interesting stuff.
Philip Mantel.
Yes.
Yeah.
there were my co-author. There were some small bodies that were swarming around the space probe before it disappeared. And I will again repeat, this was a joint Western-Soviet space mission, maybe more Western than Soviet.